and welcome to Delightful Dissent. It's episode 45, and today I'm talking to Lauren Angelil, who is a functional health coach. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Matthew. I'm really glad that I can be here with you.
Yeah, thank you. It's great to have you on. Today we're talking about objective leadership, and I think this is a really, really good one for me. But I find both of these a tricky concept. Particularly, I meet a lot of people with whom I disagree about whether they're either being leaders or being objective in both directions. um, Both in terms of there are people I think who are not, and vice versa. So I'm really, really looking forward to this one. So if you happen to be new to the show, Delightful Dissent really came about through my work working with people who are taking pioneering approaches to complex problems and seeing things in a new way. Lauren is very much one of these people. And in this work, I noticed that a lot of it often comes up that there are these hidden barriers, these implicit assumptions that really can get in the way and trip us up. And I wanted to challenge those and to share the work of other people challenging those. So I hope this show gives you specific ideas about how that you can use in your personal and professional life. But perhaps more importantly, I hope it gives you ideas about how you can go out there and challenge some assumptions of your own as well. Because ultimately, I'd like everyone to be able to get out there and do this. And the show's called Delightful Dissent because, yeah, it is about challenging how we think about things and disagreeing a little bit, and having fun whilst we do it, and coming to something nice and pleasurable rather than it being a combative thing. And this show is genuinely live, so please do bear with us if there are any technical issues. We may talk about difficult and personal topics, so if we do, then please be warned that that is a thing. And we may also use strong language, so that if that is an issue for you, then please also be warned that that is a possibility. There aren't any perfect answers here. This is about exploring, it's about asking questions of yourself and of other people. If you're watching live, you can ask us questions in the comments, either on YouTube or LinkedIn, and we can bring them in and bring them into the conversation whilst we're going, and we'd love to hear from you. If you're listening to or watching the recording, then you can get in touch with either of us, and we'll be sharing details about how you can do that at the end of the show. So I first met Lauren in a conversation on social media, actually around this idea of difficult conversations, and a post she shared around that. And we kind of got chatting, and I was really struck by her empathy for people in the role of leadership. I think this is an often overlooked area, that leaders are kind of seen as almost not having needs. And we see ourselves sometimes as our needs not mattering if we're in that position. And I was really struck by how gently, but really quite but with a really grounded set of knowledge, she worked with that. So I really wanted to share some of those ideas with you today. So if I could ask you, Lauren, to introduce yourself a little bit and the work that you do, please.
Yeah, thanks, Matthew. And thank you for bringing me on to your show. I love this idea of being able to have difficult or challenging conversations together and giving us both the freedom, and everyone who's possibly watching us and commenting, to have the freedom to disagree and challenge one another in an environment that I know is quite safe and forgiving. I think it's a brief introduction to myself. So I'm a co-founder of Well Leaders, and we work with emerging leaders and leaders who don't necessarily call themselves leaders. And I'm looking forward to going into more detail with you about this later. And we offer training, coaching, and support to equip leaders to inspire their teams, lead with authenticity, and be healthy. We see health as a health impacts leadership and leadership impacts health. We see really good research around that in both of those spaces. And we're really wanting to support and equip leaders to lead with vitality and ease.
Thank you. And so, what is it that brought you to doing this work?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I grew up in, maybe to give you a bit of context, I grew up in a family full of medical professionals and scientists. Both of my brothers have done their doctorates, and one has done a postdoc. My dad is a medical doctor, and I started off my varsity career and finished a statistics degree. And I think this brings in this idea of objectivity in leadership. And I've experienced statistical. I'm continuing that too, but because I'm also doing quantitative research at the moment, but I have roots and groundedness in numbers. And I think a lot of the leaders that we see, they also find most comfort in objects and 90-day priorities and being objective, being able to make decisions out of facts. And then I moved into more of the health and well-being space. I became a physiotherapist, and that then opened up a world of what information does our body give us when we're making decisions, when we're avoiding things. And especially in physiotherapy, there is pain-related behavior that comes in. And then I got incredibly frustrated with the healthcare world, because I was working with a lot of diabetics, so people who have metabolic health. And at any one point in my working year after varsity, I was rehabilitating at least 10 diabetic amputees. And we know that that's a place in the disease that is completely preventable. And I really wanted to get into prevention, because we know that, 1 in 10 people in the world have diabetes, which is a huge amount. And I didn't want to be helping people at that final stage of the disease, but I wanted to be helping them right at the beginning when they're getting those warning signs. And then going into this idea of, there's so many people that are impacted by their working environment. Their job satisfaction plays a huge role on leadership, and seeing how I think a lot of my friends experience this and loved ones have experienced this as emerging leaders, getting really frustrated with leadership that feels very clinical and disconnecting. And I think there are more stories around this too that maybe I can share later, but getting into really realizing that like fundamental human needs aren't being met in a lot of leadership styles. And solely looking at objectivity in leadership, or just number crunching, or getting to 90-day priorities.
Thank you. Yeah, for me, it's I very much resonate with some of those experiences, and working with people who are potential leaders, or are doing some of the significant aspects of leadership, but don't necessarily recognize themselves as such, and part of that is because they're not recognized by some others as such. And I think it's a really, really important thing to explore and to get into. So I'm really, I think it's great work, and it's really important work. So thank you. Before we get into the main bit of the talk and get into the assumption, though, I always like to ask people to share a quote with us before that kind of gives us a bit of a way into what we're going to talk about. So have you got something that you'd like to share with us?
Yes, I have a poem that I'd like to share, and I'm just taking an excerpt out of the poem. And I invite everyone who, if you're listening live with us, I'm glad to see you here. And I also invite you, if you are able and have the freedom, to lower your gaze or close your eyes and think about how the words impact you as I say them. So, this is an excerpt from the book Consolations, The Solace, Nourishment, and Underlying Meaning of Everyday Words by David White. Ambition. Ambition is frozen desire, the current of a vocational life immobilized and over-concretized to set unforgiving goals. Ambition may be essential for the young, but becomes the essential object of any attempt at a mature life. Ambition abstracts us from the underlying elemental nature of the creative conversation, while providing us the cover of a target that has become false through over-description, over-familiarity, and too much understanding. The ease of having an ambition is that it can be explained to others. The very dis-ease of ambition is that it can be so easily explained to others. I'll stop there.
Wow, thank you. There's a lot there for me. Is there any one aspect that you feel really does relate to specifically to what we're talking about today?
Yeah. So when I first heard this poem, it really struck me. I was almost quite shocked at almost the disgruntledness that frustration that comes out in the poem about ambition. And I think that that's also something that we see. There are similarities with ambition and objectivity. And a lot of the people that I work with, they are very much guided by strategies and processes and getting somewhere that feels objective and rational. And in many ways it's very easy and very rewarding. I mean, I myself have found ticking off numbers or getting a right answer in statistics incredibly rewarding. And yet, I think what David White is saying here about it's an obstacle at an attempt to a mature life is quite true. And then there's this question of, well, what is a mature life? And later he also talks about being able to, and I encourage anyone to go and look up this poem by David White, because I think there's a lot of wisdom in this. But he encourages us to find the connection where both ambition and failure meet and come more into this idea of compassion and understanding of others.
I think for me, yeah, there's something actually came up for me. It just seems slightly trivial, but I want to share it anyway. There's something related in this. How a joke stops being funny when you explain it. You know, it feels kind of related somehow. You know, there's things have their own intrinsic quality, their own whatever they are-ness. And when we pin them down too much, they lose that. They lose the essence, their own life, their own energy, and that feels like a very big loss. So how does that relate to this idea of objective leadership for you?
Well, I think the other side of objectivity, and I often like to talk about this in terms of how leaders make decisions. What are the ways that leaders can make decisions? And that the ideas of objectivity, I think we've spoken about, Matthew, of looking at the facts, making sure that things are aligned, making sure that that there is you're able to factually back yourself up. And yet I also see leaders making decisions or trying to make a decision because they have a gut feel that this is the right decision. And then holding that tension, well, I don't have the facts or the answers or the justification at my fingertips right now, but I'm feeling the strong sense that I need to do X. And the question mark is there. Well, then what do you do as a leader? How do you hold the tension of opposites? within yourself, but also when you're trying to make a decision and there are possibly external and internal pressures around you.
It's it is such a challenge, I think. For me, I understand objectivity is pertaining to a specific framing, a specific set of assumptions. And that beyond that, we can't, it requires that. It's the same related to rationality, really. It has a framing, it has a specific space. And within that, we can be really clear. I'm really certain, and everything can be aligned in the way that people tend to be comfortable with. Outside of that, though, there isn't the same. We don't have that. And the question is very much, for me, around, if we are seeking to be objective, then are we being objective in a helpful frame, rather than are we being objective in kind of in abstract? Because actually that doesn't, we don't have that capability. That I think it's really interesting, because I like you, I share a science background, and I also share a mixture of hard science and social science. So I have this. There is always this tension between the two, and it's a really difficult thing. And for me, it's like, well, yes, we can say, okay, we've determined this. But when you work with scientists, you realize actually they always describe that frame very carefully, and only ever work within that. And it's like, okay, we've described this, and then this happens in this. Rather than being able to generalize and say, this is always true in every possible circumstance.
Yeah.
And it's that generalization that can be the really tricky point.
Yeah, and economics, we often talk about ceteris paribus. Like, this is an assumption given all else is equal. And in the real world, how do we get to that point, or then what do we do? How do we manage uncertainty and be able to make decisions that end up having a great outcome for everyone involved?
And for me, one of the really interesting things is when you're writing a scientific paper, essentially you get to choose the frame, you describe it, and you constrain it in ways that you can work with, to a greater or lesser extent, depending on where the research participants take you. But anyway, and certainly if you're working with inanimate systems, you can usually achieve that. If you're working in a leadership role, you don't have that opportunity. You don't actually have the ability to constrain the space in which you're working in that way. You can go to the bits that you don't know, and the bits that you can kind of go to the edge of what you know and what you don't know. And for me, this is a key place of it's the place where I specifically work, in this place of uncertainty. And for me, uncertainty is one of those words that's actually slightly, people like kind of know, okay, uncertainty. What makes it uncertain for me is it lies between what we know for sure and what we don't know at all. It's in that space between. And that space between is a very, very difficult space for many people to occupy. If you don't know at all, it's kind of, we don't tend to worry about that. And if we know for sure, we don't tend to worry about that so much. The uncertain is a difficult space. And for when we encounter that, when we realize we are starting to move into that space, there are various ways to respond, and some of them are more helpful and some of them are less helpful.
Yeah, I love that that frame that you've put to us here, because I often see the emotion that comes up in that uncertain space is often confusion. but you can have too much uncertainty and then you just drop everything. So you're not going to engage. You just leave it. It's too confusing. But there is a sweet spot of confusion and uncertainty where there is growth and learning. And finding that sweet spot is really important. And I'm just reading, Matthew, the comments that have come in. Francis talks about the notion of a zero-sum economy and how it seems relevant here. And I think exactly what I thought, Francis, from that comment is, we often think about work-life balance and how it's either one or the other. And what about this idea of it's not a zero-sum game? The more the satisfaction and the quality, the more relationships and the more the interest that you have in your work and being able to create trust and connection at work, that can create an upward spiral of well-being and productivity in what you do. And I would say that this isn't in that space. It isn't a zero-sum game if you're able to do both.
Similarly, I find that, again, what language can be tricky here, because balance in particular is a difficult word, because balance can sometimes mean this kind of positive sum relationship between two different entities, or it can mean essentially a really miserable, well, like zero-sum compromises are a euphemism, because they are always loss compromises because of entropy. Nothing's perfect, right? So any time we aim for zero sum, we end up with lower than zero sum. We end up with a loss. And this idea of these kind of mutual losses, like where both parties agree to lose a similar amount, for me, the question is then why do that at all? And I think that's actually an important question in this space. Is sometimes the answer is like, don't do something. If we can't at least have a sense that we're going to be creating something positive sum, why do it?
I'm curious if you have examples of that can bring it to life, Matthew.
I'm trying to think. I mean, I think very often the phrase is a compromise, and you end up in a situation where we say, where one party is compromising with another, and it becomes that idea of, and this relates to objectivity and particularly to the concept of fairness, which is very often misapplied. Is fairness, again, implies a framework. It implies we're making decisions within and we're balancing within. So if you are having a conversation between two parties who disagree or want different things, and you are seeking to be fair, you are implicitly setting a frame. If that frame actually benefits one party or another, it changes the relationship within. And this is something very often in the work I do with marginalized groups and minority groups, is that the framing, the default framing, is implicitly biased against them. So something that is fair still has that bias.
Yeah.
This is the difference between equality and equitability. And why equitability is much more important. And I think understanding that in the context of leadership is a really, really important one. Aiming to be an equitable leader rather than aiming to be a leader, an equal leader, because that actually isn't, there's something really important there around our, how we conduct ourselves in relation to others.
I think that's a great example. It brings up the idea of discrimination, and in many ways, discrimination is terrible, but in many ways, discrimination can be vitally important, just like bringing in the voices of minority groups. And we see this in Black empowerment policies, that you are actually discriminating towards someone to improve their well-being. And it's that that equity versus equality. It's not about fairness. It's not about equal portions of the pie. It's about bringing up everyone so that they can have the opportunities that the other has.
I think for me, yeah, that we are always discriminating, in a sense. We're always making decisions. We're always filtering, choosing a frame. Mm-hmm. The extent to which you can be aware of the processes by which you have come to that are so important in being able to work out whether it's whether it's really helpful, whether it's really something that feels like you and feels sincere, and feels like something aligned with what you actually want to express.
Yeah.
So, and I think this is a good place to bring in the role of embodiment into this, and yeah, how do you see that related to the knowing beyond the very kind of the cognitive deterministic mechanical way of thinking?
And before Matthew, I go into that, I just one more comment around this. And Craig in our comments section has said that curiosity is super important. And this idea of creating understanding between two people, Matthew, you brought up this concept of often it's like a win or lose. And we also see this in challenging conversations. If people go in with the mindset of wanting to win or overcome something or prove their argument, that kind of battle head isn't actually serving the ability for them to connect with their teams. And how do you then frame it? So let me figure out what you want, and bringing in that sense of curiosity, and bringing in what I want, bringing in like what is it that we need to decide on that will help both of us go forward and have that that exchange that is serving both of us in the conversation.
Thank you. Yeah, that's that sense of curiosity, or what I've often experienced engaging with leaders I did not get on well with is that my own curiosity, because I'm intensely curious. I can't kind of help it. I ask difficult questions without really thinking about it. I don't have the, like many people with those kind of ADHD cognitive traits, I just, I make connections all the time, and it takes you to places that are sometimes unwelcome, or and that ability to question and to explore and to question, particularly at the edges of the if people don't have that, I really struggle to be me, actually, because then I know I will say something wrong and take people to that place. So I think having that innate sense and being comfortable with your own curiosity and other people's is so important.
And then to answer your question around, well, how then are we able to, or what are the different areas that we can make decisions from? My phrasing isn't so good with that. But so I think a lot of us think in the headspace of this objectivity, and in so many ways it's incredibly helpful. And then I also see people who are able to connect with their emotions and their body, and see them all as data points. And I think you can have incredible power with emotions. There is, I think, there are lots of myths about emotions, and one of the ones that I think are really important to name here is that emotions are negative. And I really hope that people can take the negative out of emotions. They're just emotions. And in many ways, they point us to really valuable pieces of information. For example, if you're experiencing anger, then anger often means that you're needing to put up some boundaries. So it gives you a useful frame of then how can I use this emotion? And what are my next steps because I'm dealing with this emotion? And And I think often it's frustrating, and maybe people who are listening to this also experience people blaming emotions or saying, "Oh, you're bringing emotion into this," like we shouldn't, or that it's like it's not part of how we make decisions or how we are in this world. And I think there's a very different kind of conversation we can have between experiencing emotion compared to reacting rather than responding, because the emotion will always be there, but what you choose to do with it is really important. But crucially, that it's very that there are data points in emotions that we can use to make decisions. And I'll stop there and see if you have any comments before I go into more of that bodily sense.
Definitely. No, I want to add, I similarly use in psychological terms, is the affect as information theory. I think it can be useful to tease apart sometimes what we mean by emotions and feelings, and affect is a technical word that kind of means like feelings before their emotions, almost. The broad level of the sensations, not the specific sensations, but the overall quality of a rising experience. And that's a really, really important steer about what's going on. And yeah, I completely agree, that it also does very much guide us to be able to respond. If we can't experience those emotions, we can't work with them. And their role is to keep us safe and to orient us to stuff that's good for us generally. I think the other big one, as well as anger in this space, is fear. And fear is a really important emotion. It's really helpful for keeping us safe. And the capacity to be able to kind of be with fear and understand it and work with it, for me, is very closely related to our ability to work safely at an edge, at an uncertain point. And if that's not a core leadership skill, I don't know what is. So that it's to work with the emotions, I think, rather than against them, to try and squash them, and relatedly, to cultivate the awareness using other people's awareness in this, because that's the other part of it, is that we all experience the world somewhat differently. Some of us quite significantly differently, and therefore we're aware of things that others are not. And those things are no less real for that. And being able to work with others' perceptions well, even when they don't line up with ours, when they're aware of something we're not, or vice versa, is a huge, huge skill that is regrettably quite rare.
Yes, and I think again it brings us back to this point of curiosity. Coming with curiosity first when there is confusion or a lack of understanding, I think, is vital in creating that shared experience, or at least that empathy for someone else's situation. I think, yeah, we just don't know often if what the other person's experience is, and coming with a lens of, I'm really wanting to find out what this other person is going through, what they're experiencing, and knowing that my experience isn't their experience, and listening and understanding to hear their experience and meet them where they're at is a part of leadership.
Absolutely. I think Craig commented and said, interesting how curiosity overlaps a lot with compassion and empathy when we're talking about useful leadership. So yeah, I think very much. I think that's exactly that, really. Yeah, completely. I would really like to start talking about the kind of the embodied side of this,
Yes.
though I think it's worth linking and noting that to some significant degree, our capacity to work with our own experience and our own feelings relates to our ability to work with others' experience and their feelings. As I understand the physiology, we're probably using the same mechanisms either way, ultimately, on a neurological level. We're sensing into our bodies regardless, and it's the mirror neurons simulating someone else's physiological state that are where we get some of that contextualization and understanding of how they are. So this capacity of embodiment is not just about self-awareness, though that's hugely important, but it actually cultivates that ability to work with others as well.
Yeah, I wonder if we can start with self-awareness first.
Yeah.
And it's one of the core modules that we take people through in our program, which is developing the awareness, because without being able to see it in yourself, you aren't able usually to see it in others. And what I was talking about in terms of emotions, of how emotions are very informative, we can also pick up on those emotions in our bodies. And there was an incredible article that came out and mapped different emotions in the body. So where are you feeling? And they had a huge sample size. It was very statistically significant. They had a map of all the different kinds of emotions that you feel and where you habitually feel them in your body. So, for example, anger was mainly felt in the hands and in the head and chest center. And then the more the emotions like sadness and depression almost was a decrease in activation in senses in the limbs. So almost like a numbness or a cooling in the limbs. And they mapped out a whole bunch of emotions and showed that we know that emotions are data points, but we also know that how they come up and how they're expressed in your body are data points too. And this was really interesting research. And also, I mean, everyone has experience going to a job interview or going into an exit interview with a team member that you have, or going over performance reviews and feeling the sense of anxiety, and then noticing maybe clammy hands or a beating chest. All of these are physiological responses to emotions.
Yeah, it's interesting how, there are differences in the way that we experience things, but there actually are much greater commonalities. And I think that study is really good at highlighting that, and quite how embodied our experience of any of these feelings are. And it's worth remembering that these are partly around the physical preparation for the associated activities, whatever they would have been probably historically. Those activities may not necessarily be appropriate in a modern office setting, but our body is preparing us for a certain sort of activity associated with feeling a certain way. It's getting us ready to do something. And we can kind of tell what it's getting us ready to do. What's the body preparing for? Because the mind is quite often kind of on its own, like somewhat related. But like knowing what our body's anticipating and trying to work with, and how it's trying to work with that is a really big part of this. Partly because when the two don't line up, it can be very difficult.
Yeah, I see Francis's comment saying that's fascinating. So if you find embodiment challenging, then maybe you will be depressed. And I think you might be, but also I see that often we're not as in tune with our bodies as because we haven't spent time tapping into that data point. So in our society, I think we just don't have, number one, the vocabulary for emotions, and number two, the self-awareness of feeling those emotions. And yet I think we've also all experienced feelings, or possibly all experienced feelings of heartache, and feeling that sense of numbness that comes with it. And that's also a sign from the body. Or I think one of the other things that they spoke about was sensations in the digestive system, and the areas around the throat was mainly found with disgust. So that disgust feeling is the digestive system going, and that's also quite fascinating where those different emotions come up and why. And then we can also go into like butterflies in the tummy for love. All of those kinds of, I think we actually have the words, and now science have said, well, yeah, this is true.
Absolutely, and it's funny how so many of those metaphors for feelings are deeply embodied. Heartbreak is literally, it's that experience of and as is knots in the stomach and all of those things, and that we really do experience these things on a very physical level. I think for me, there's a number of things going on in that relationship with embodiment, and the question about depression is an interesting one. There is a numbing associated with depression, but that's not the only reason. And just like you say, Lauren, for me, this is actually a question of practice to some significant degree, that we simply don't. Well, our ability, our connections, our neuronal connections with the senses in our body, with the bits that are giving us information from our body, are only developed when we spend time with them and experience them. There's it's one of the really interesting things about how flexible the nervous system is and our systems are in general, is that by actually engaging with this, we can develop this capacity to quite a deep degree, even if we started from not having had that opportunity for whatever reason.
I'm just laughing at Francis's comment. What does tingles on the scalp mean? Feeling that now. Francis, I wonder if your kids have any challenges at play school with lice or coming around. I'm joking. I'm not sure what that means.
It's tingling on the scalp is usually the pilatory response. It's hair standing on end. So it's that happens in response to some rising emotional, there's some emotional resonance of some description. In humans, it can be positive or negative. In other animals, it's, like in dogs, famously, the hackles on the back of the neck are usually a sign of aggression. But in humans, it's both ways. It's similar to the frisson experience of hairs standing on end on our arms or similar. So it's usually that kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, maybe have you tried a new shampoo?
Yeah, I think this is a really important. It's funny, but you make such an important point about these sensational things, is that they can be caused by all sorts of different things. It can be because we feel a certain way, and it can be for very simple physical reasons. And being able to tell those apart is so important in decision making.
Yeah, I love what you're saying here, and also what Laura's just put into the chat too, that this is about practice, and I think and we're just not being practiced in the professional context, and also how I think one of the things that I like to talk about and I'm passionate about is this idea of authentic leadership, and that self-awareness and is one of the 4 traits of authentic leadership. But that's self-awareness is all around knowing your own self, knowing your identity, and knowing the emotions that come up for you and why they come up. And this is all around being able to practice these skills.
I think the practice of it's one thing to understand these on a scientific level. It's one of my favorite. Again, this feels, when I say favorite, quite often with psychology papers, it means I find this kind of slightly disturbing but very interesting. And it falls into this category, is the research on whether knowing about implicit biases affects our implicit biases. And the paper concludes very convincingly and thoroughly that you can consciously know about biases, and it does not affect whether or not you are biased at all. So there's a disconnect between the kind of cognitive, logical knowing a fact and how we operationalize it in the world. And for me, it's only through practice that we can link those things up.
If I'm understanding you correctly, Matthew, it's around being aware of your own biases and then being able to make a choice of what to do with that.
Absolutely. But also really where we're trying to manifest a certain behavior or create certain change in us, it's not enough just to know and think, okay, I want that. We actually have to try it out and see. And I think a lot of this for me is related to seeing how something feels. And this is one of the really big challenges. I've worked with essentially change and development programs for pretty much all of my career in one way or another. And there are very often in some organizations these kind of ongoing conversations about like, well, we don't know what this is going to be like. We can't know. And then you spend a very large amount of time discussing it and trying to figure it out objectively. And it turns out not to be very useful. A much quicker way to do it is just to try it out. Even in very, very simple simulation ways, it just has to feel a bit like it. And that gets our embodied sense. Making it embodied is a huge part of being able to actually understand and use this other thinking as well.
Yeah. I love what you're saying here. And also, there was a particular thing that you brought up, although I also know that Francis is in the chat and now I'm getting a bit distracted. I think you're used to this, Matthew, and this incredible multitasking that you seem to be able to do here.
Continuous partial attention. Yeah. So I think I think in some ways that relates, actually. We all have different cognitive capabilities for whatever reason, and they are embodied. They're related to our embodiment. And the extent to which we can really work with that in ourselves and others is to a large degree the extent to which we can be successful as a group. We can work well together as a group.
I remember my thought now, Matthew. This idea of the story that you told of going through things very deliberately as a team, but then not finding it that useful, and how action was something that was the most useful thing, even if there is so much uncertainty. And I think we see that a lot, and we like to call it the experiments that you put out into the world. You learn so much by doing. And so often people talk about how they love learning, but often that's a very passive form of learning, reading lots of books, taking courses, lots of absorbing of information, but not necessarily acting it out. And that there's just, you have to have the mindset of being okay at failing and not getting things right, and also knowing that there is a lot of learnings that come with failure and experimentation, and a lot of growth that comes from that action focus.
I think related to the objectivity, to this idea of objective leadership, one of the great leadership fears seems to be that invalidation of the previous perspective that we were working in. That fear that if we find something else out, it will invalidate what we've been doing up until now, and we don't have the time or the resources or the whatever to fix it, or that as a leader I will have been responsible for that. And there's a huge wrap of fear around that we might find something out there in uncertainty that changes what we've done already.
And not much forgiveness or self-compassion around that. I think that often happens with ambition and wanting to get things done, and the huge standard that I often see leaders hold themselves to and don't hold anyone else to. And they wouldn't hold even a good friend to that. And I think that piece around being able to pivot as new information comes in, being able to go back to the drawing board and process things in a community that you feel safe in, is an incredibly powerful place for leaders to grow and flourish.
And I think I always like to caveat the word safe, partly from a history of working in organizations that sought a very high degree of safety to the point at which it actually reduced safety. And that can be very problematic. But for me, it's about safe enough. This is what in some ways explaining what an experiment means. It's like, we don't know what's going to happen. We want to not be so committed to a specific outcome that objective is probably not the right word. I think is disinterested in the outcome is probably a better word. We don't have a big stake one way or the other. It's more important that we know and find out than it is the specifics of what we find out.
Yeah, the key word for me here is flexibility. Because once you can have flexibility in your goals, that allows for compassion and understanding and being able to pivot. And I think there's another whole discussion on the word safety and cancel culture that has come out in the past few years, and how there is very little forgiveness in the world within that space. But I think we can talk for hours on that.
Yes, I think how we negotiate these edges of understanding, our own individual ones within a group and our collective ones, the collective bits we don't understand, feels like absolutely, the limits of objectivity here that we're talking about.
Yeah, and I think maybe this is a good time for me to share some of those other 3 attributes of authentic leadership. One of them has got to do with balance processing, and that's when objectivity does come in and you're looking at all sides of an argument to make a decision. But the other ones I'd like to share here, the first is self-awareness. And I spoke to this earlier, of knowing yourself, knowing your emotions and what they mean. The next is relational transparency. And so you're able to show up in the world with your team members and people that you're working with the sense of transparency that this is why you're doing the things that you're doing. And that creates trust and dependability and connection within teams. And then the last one is this internalized moral perspective. And I think leaders often grapple with this when they have pressures, both internally and externally, to make the right decision. I put it in quotation marks because what are they measuring themselves against? But also just adhering, I think the idea around this is still adhering to a strong ethical code in their decision making, so that they can make decisions that are good not only for shareholders but for the world at large.
And I think what's interesting for me is how all of those kind of support one another and interrelate. They're not things in isolation. And I perhaps that really does kind of bring us to, for me, is no leadership, no behavior, no person, no project enterprise happens in isolation. It doesn't happen in the perfect abstract. It reminds me of that old physics joke about, if you assume the chicken is a perfect sphere traveling in a vacuum, we have to work with partial information. We have to work with, with models, with
Yeah, yeah,
incomplete knowledge,
yeah.
with unpredictability, with complexity. And we can use tools like objective tools to work with that. But
Mhm.
it's about knowing which ones to choose and when to use them and when to use something else.
And I think the challenge that I often see here, Matthew, is that leadership can be incredibly lonely.
Mm.
Their leaders are they're often their responsibility is to make a lot of important decisions, and it can feel lonely if they're feeling the weight on their shoulders. um, and and being able to be in a space or have a community that you're able to connect up with is important, so that you have the space to think through challenging decisions and be able to come out the other side feeling supported, feeling confident, and feeling like you've made a decision that is in line with what you care about.
Absolutely. I completely agree. I think there's two aspects to that as well. There's the within the team, within the group, and fostering that and your ability to do that within, and also with peers, with others, exploring slightly different things. My own work, specifically working with people who are leading in this exploratory space rather than
Mhm.
leading in more known domains.
Mhm.
And that is a huge part of feeling, not feeling like it's, I think that feeling of it's just being us, it's all on us as an individual,
Mhm.
it's
Mhm.
unbearable.
Mhm.
It really is. And being able to shift that and work with others around it is absolutely. I'd recommend anyone kind of who takes on any form of responsibility, organizational authority, anything like that, seeks to have that support in place as much as possible.
Yeah, and yet it's so difficult to ask for help. I think
Mm,
that's also a challenge, to seek support.
it really is. So, I mean, I think we've covered a huge area, and we're reaching the end of the show. I think I'd like to ask you, in terms of, if someone has been listening to this and is thinking, yes, actually, this is something I'd like to develop further. First of all, I'd like to ask you, really in general terms, the kind of things that they can start doing, and then we can talk about exactly the ways that they might be able to do that with you specifically as well.
Mhm, mhm. I think the first thing that they can start doing is trying to identify emotions that are coming up in themselves. So I think there was research done, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Matthew, but I think people only know like 3 to 5 feeling words, and actually there are so many. And being able to name an emotion, there's also good research to show this. Just being able to simply name an emotion reduces that reactivity center and fear center in our brain, the amygdala. So I suppose I encourage everyone to try and notice the emotions that they're feeling, give it a label, and see how that then transforms what you do next. So just simply naming the emotions that come up in your life and guessing the emotions that other people are experiencing in your own life. And I say guessing, this is almost showing up a mirror, so reflecting back to someone the emotions that they're experiencing and asking, getting curious. We spoke about curiosity later. Asking is this what you're feeling? I just want to check it out. Is this what you're feeling? And being okay receiving a no, that's not what I'm feeling. My husband always says, you sound frustrated, and he says it all the time now, that I'm like, no, it's not frustration. So yeah, those are 2 things that I want to invite people to do.
They're both really, really great tips. I think one of the things relating to the idea of emotions as telling us something important is that they do tend to diminish once they've done that job. It's almost like just a little notification, and once you've read it and ticked it, it goes. And so, actually, if we kind of want to reduce that emotional temperature, um, or the urgency, the emotional urgency of a situation, then actually attending to those in detail is a really helpful approach, I think. And the other relatedly, I think for me, understanding that we are always sensing into other people's, we can't fully read other people's and emotions and emotional state. We're sensing something that's really between rather than in. So for me, I personally tend to use the phrasing, I have a sense of, if I'm sensing into something, because that's actually, for me, that's more sincere. It's kind of I'm kind of sensing it, and it might just be me. But it might also be in someone else, and it gives people the space to explore their own meaning making within that as well, and which is helpful.
And then the second thing that people can reach out to me around is, so the Well Leaders team, we're launching a challenging conversation course, and I'm delighted to be launching with them in March. It's a 12-week, really small leadership program that we're guiding leaders to have challenging conversations and still be able to create that trust and connection within their teams. So if you'd like to find out more about that, we have a free email series that my colleague Eric put together. He playfully named it How Not to Be a Jerk at Work. And you'll get some tips on how to do exactly that. And you'll also hear more about the Challenging Conversations program that we have launching in March. You can also schedule a call with me, and I'm happy to chat it through with you. I will put a link in the chat box, and we'll see if it can come up for us.
Lovely, thank you. Yeah, so we've got a link to the website and actually to the Challenging Conversations program. But yeah, so you can share a link to the to the Well Leaders. Sure. So I will just quickly share that link in the chat, hopefully. I'm not sure that will go out on LinkedIn as well, because we have different technology, but we can go back there. So we'll make sure that that's available to you wherever you happen to look for it in the comments and everything. So that's great. Thank you so much for appearing on the show. And I should say, to find anything else, it is wellleaders.com is the URL to check out if you want to find any of this stuff or find out more about Lauren's work as well, which is great. Yeah, thank you so much. That was a really fascinating conversation, I feel. Thank you everyone for your comments as well. I definitely could have talked about this for a lot longer. There's a lot more I think we could discuss on this. So thank you all for your input, and thank you so much, Lauren, for bringing such an interesting perspective to us.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Matthew. It was such a delight.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, so I really do hope that got you in the audience thinking and asking questions. So if you do have questions, please do reach out to Lauren or myself and share and continue this conversation whilst it is, whilst I do kind of just use this show to have interesting conversations with people. It gives me a lot more, it makes it a lot easier to ask them, but when the audience is actually listening, and to widen the conversation. So it's your support really that makes the show possible. So please do share it with anyone you think would find it useful and interesting. You can find upcoming and past episodes on YouTube and LinkedIn, and the podcast is available, though I am still working on getting the more recent episodes out. And you can search for Delightful Dissent on whatever your favorite podcast platform is. The next episode is going to be around the assumption or the idea, don't limit yourself. And I'm going to be talking to Mark Stedman, who is a podcast consultant, producer, and coach around this one. I think this is a really interestingly related one, actually. I think an objective frame on some level is a limit. And how we choose those limits is really important. But I have an ongoing and awkward relationship with limits, sometimes finding them useful, sometimes finding them immensely frustrating. And I've spent certainly a lot of my life worrying about my particular ones as well, and trying to resolve them in ways that weren't necessarily that helpful. So I'm really, really interested to explore this one further. And that is going to be in a fortnight's time, so 1 p.m. UK time on Wednesday, the 2nd of March. I hope to see you then, and in the meantime, please do go out there and make some delightful dissent of your own. Thanks very much, and goodbye.